The Choices and Challenges Forum series was developed at Virginia Tech to explore the ethical and social dimensions of science and technology. The following presentation, taken from one of the forums in the Choices and Challenges series, is made possible by a grant from the Center for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Additional support has been provided by Video Broadcast Services and the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Virginia Tech.
Heart disease and cancer are the two big killers in our society. Vascular diseases account for approximately half of all the deaths, with cancer making up about 1/4 of the deaths. Both of these diseases are related to diet, but you can't lose sight of the fact that there are many other factors that are quite important. In my estimation, genetics is by far the most important single factor involved. Of the environmental variables, I think use of tobacco and abuse of alcohol are very, very important. Heart disease is often described as an epidemic in our society, so it's instructive to look to see what's been happening over time. And in this graphic you can see that non-vascular disease in blue has decreased slowly but consistently over the last 25 years. In green, cardiovascular disease has decreased much more quickly. And in red, specifically coronary heart disease, since the 1960s has decreased more than 30%. This decline began before any identifiable drop in the risk factors that we can measure. And what this translates into is a longer life expectancy. This graphic shows a World Health Organization map showing life expectancy, with life expectancies in the lighter colors being longer, yellow being 70 years or greater. And if you note, North America and all of Europe, the countries that eat the so-called killer diet, high in fat and low in fiber, live longer than any of the countries that we're supposed to be emulating dietarily. This doesn't necessarily translate into a direct causal relationship, because epidemiology of diet and disease cannot demonstrate causality, but it also shows that the international comparisons are necessarily fairly weak. Since the data are stronger for the relationship of diet and heart disease than the relationship of diet and cancer, I think it's instructive to examine this particular relationship more closely. Heart attack rates go up with increasing serum cholesterol. In this particular chart, there's a big jump around 240 to 260 milligrams. The range varies from study to study. And animal studies confirm this, that if all things are equal, higher cholesterol is worse. And it's clear that some types of saturated fat raise serum cholesterol and increase the risk of heart disease. I think it's also instructive to look at some of the published studies, and I'd like to just briefly quote from a study that is probably the best, biggest, and most well-done epidemiologic study, the one in Framingham, Massachusetts, that's been going on for many years. And Dr. William Castelli wrote in the American Journal of Medicine, in Framingham, in 30 years, we have yet to report a myocardial infarction, that is a heart attack, in any person whose cholesterol was 150 milligrams or below. Of course, there is no one in Framingham with a cholesterol level under 150 milligrams. Now, this has been picked up by Medical World News, for instance, a news publication for physicians, and they wrote 2 years later, data from the Framingham study revealed a threshold for cholesterol. At levels below 150 milligrams, myocardial infarctions are nearly non-existent. And this has been relayed by other scientific publications. Lipid Digest, a year and a half ago, wrote, regardless of age, participants in Framingham with total cholesterol levels under 150 milligrams had very few heart attacks. And I think it's very easy to get carried away with extracting simple points and misinterpreting them. Total cholesterol is clearly a risk factor for heart disease, but it's only a rough statistical indicator of the risk or the odds of developing a heart attack. A study recently done at Johns Hopkins University hospitals surveyed 2,000 heart attack victims, and half of them had cholesterol under 200 milligrams in the desirable range. This study really showed that HDL cholesterol, or high-density lipoprotein cholesterol, was a better indicator of risk, but there is no test that we have that predicts risk of an individual for developing a heart attack. The National Cholesterol Education Program is partly responsible for the medical and public interest in this relationship. And the one study that's the major justification for this program was the Lipid Research Clinics trial, which cost over $150 million and took 10 years to complete. And I'd like to describe a few points about this study, which has been highly cited in both the medical and public press. 480,000 men were screened to get 3,800 qualified participants. Fewer than 1% of the people who were studied were qualified to participate in this study. These men all had serum cholesterol levels higher than 95% of the population. The average was over 290 milligrams. If diet normalized the serum cholesterol levels of these men, they were removed from the study. This was a study done in men who were resistant to dietary change. The study was of a cholesterol-lowering drug called cholestyramine. And there's quite a lot of controversy that's been published in the last several years in the medical literature over the significance of the results of this study. And I'd like to just give you a few of the actual numbers from that study. Over 7.5 years of follow-up, there were 38 deaths from coronary heart disease in the control group, and there were 30 in the drug-treated men, a difference of 8. In non-fatal heart attacks, there were 158 in the control men and 130 in the drug-treated men. And I'd just like to point out one fact that is in the original report in the medical journal that most people ignore about this particular drug and this particular study. This drug, cholestyramine, is not absorbed from the intestine. It also has the texture of sand, and it produces chronic irritation. And I'd like to just cite the numbers of gastrointestinal cancers that were discovered during the same 7.5-year period. In the control men, there were 11 cases with 1 death. But in the drug-treated men, there were 21 cases with 8 deaths. And this is dismissed by the investigators who conducted the study as a chance occurrence. Now, the actual difference here is 7 deaths due to cancer excess in the drug-treated men and 8 heart attacks prevented. Yet they claim that a statistically significant benefit of the drug was reducing those 8 heart attacks, but there was a chance occurrence of increasing those 7 cancer deaths. Another major study was the Mr. Fit study. Mr. Fit is an acronym for Multiple Risk Factor Intervention Trial. In this study, 361,000 men were screened to get to 2 treatment groups of approximately 6,000 men each. And this graphic shows the relationship of serum cholesterol levels to heart disease mortality on the bottom curve and total mortality on the top curve. In this study, it can be seen that heart disease rises only gradually until above 250 milligrams per deciliter, and that total mortality increases at very low cholesterol levels, here below 160 milligrams. In other studies, it has been even higher. Studies have shown 180 milligrams is the cutoff for where there's increased risk. But what's interesting from this particular graph is that total mortality is virtually unchanged until cholesterol is above 250 milligrams. There really is very little benefit on overall life expectancy. And that's one of the very troubling points about all of the cholesterol intervention trials that have been published. Whether or not they've shown a beneficial effect in reducing heart attacks or deaths from heart attack, there has never been a study published that has increased life expectancy by lowering serum cholesterol. Very interestingly, in the last month, a 10.5-year follow-up was published to the Mr. Fit study, because in the original publication there was no difference in heart disease outcome in the treated men and the controls. And the treated men had 3 various treatments. They were to reduce cigarette use, to control blood pressure through drugs, and to control serum cholesterol through diet. Now, the argument was in the original publication that the control men made similar changes to the intervention group, and therefore they could not demonstrate a significant benefit. But at the 10.5-year follow-up just recently published, there is a significant benefit shown to the intervention group. And I think this negates the original argument that the controls improved their health habits. So again, I think we really don't know if the Mr. Fit trial was a success or not. I want to take a few minutes describing a study that was also recently published that was done about 25 years ago. The Minnesota Coronary Survey involved 9,000 institutionalized patients in mental hospitals. Half of them were put on a low cholesterol, high polyunsaturated fat diet. This study was conducted from the late 1960s through the early 1970s, but was only published last year. In this study, serum cholesterol went from 207 to 175 with a high polyunsaturated fat diet. Cardiovascular disease was identical in both groups over the entire follow-up period, but shown in this graphic is total mortality. And the solid line shows what's happened to the people on the high polyunsaturated fat diet. Their lines are starting to diverge and getting further and further apart after 2 years of follow-up. And what this shows is that most of the detrimental effect occurred in women, suggesting that a single dietary recommendation may not be appropriate for the entire population. It's clear that this recommendation of high polyunsaturated fat that was promoted 25 years ago was incorrect and possibly dangerous. Current recommendations contradict those older ones. One example that I think should hit home to many of us is the use of olive oil. 10 years ago, most cardiologists told their patients that olive oil was similar to poison for them. Now it is a preferred fat for most people. I think all this points out that we do not have the final answers to these very complicated diseases of cancer and heart disease. Virtually all scientists acknowledge that both diseases have multiple causes. So attributing so much effect to diet simply defies what is known. The lack of perspective in attributing diseases to specific foods rather than the total diet and caloric balance shows a poor understanding of our current state of knowledge. I think finally, the scientific method requires some degree of certainty, not absolute proof of a relationship between diet and disease to recommend changes, but I think the burden of proof should rest on those who want to make major changes in the diet. Thank you.
I had a question for David Klurfeld, and I needed to ask a question within the panel. Dr. Klurfeld, in his talk, discussed several very well-done studies in which there was very small percentages between the numbers of people having cardiovascular disease in the control group. One of the problems with epidemiological study, and I think Mr. Ronk touched on this also, is that to do the long-term longitudinal studies that are needed to really see this difference is extremely difficult. You're dealing with a very narrow funding window. Many of these studies are obligated to demonstrate some results within a fixed period of time. And as one begins to see a trend, there are many times in medicine when one sees a trend that is clearly indicating that there is a benefit to doing something, an intervention, or there is harm. I think if one looks at the data that you've referred to very carefully, that small percentage can be looked at in several ways. You can look at the small difference that it represents in the total population, or you can look at the somewhat larger difference that represents in the percentage of people that got the disease versus those that did not get the disease. I think if one looks at those numbers and then carries that type of study out over time, longitudinally over a generation, I think we're clearly going to see an increasing body of evidence that indicates that there is ample information that moderate dietary recommendations, as are suggested in the Surgeon General's report and the American Heart Association's report, will indeed, over time, reduce the incidence of cardiac disease in a population. I think the public needs to know that.
I think there's a lot of evidence to support your point of view, but I think there also are a lot of data on the opposite end of the spectrum. We can't necessarily extrapolate from men at highest risk for heart disease by virtue of very high serum cholesterol to people with normal cholesterol levels or even moderately elevated. It's perhaps a leap of faith to extrapolate from men to women because they don't necessarily respond the same way to diet. It brings up the points Dr. Moran was discussing, that the scientific process is a gradual building up of a foundation of knowledge. And I think that at this point, health policy is running ahead of the science base. And we have to weigh the risk-benefit ratio. And is there a risk to low-fat diets? Well, it seems to be effective in reducing heart disease. It seems to be effective in reducing the risk of breast cancer and colon cancer. But it seems also to increase the risk of stroke and other types of cancer. So I think that one has to weigh the whole picture, and it's very difficult to know for sure if that type of policy is going to harm certain people. I don't think we should make major changes in the diet unless we're really certain that there is very little risk. I think one of the problems also is the tremendous public interest in medical studies and nutrition and health studies over the last several years has, in a way, caused the news media to treat single studies as definitive conclusions in the field. And most people lose sight of the fact that there's a large mass of evidence and the scientific process is continually evolving, and that nutrition is probably one of the softer sciences because it's very difficult to measure causality in human studies. So we rely on the animal studies and we get different results. And we're not sure if the animal study agrees with the human study, we say, aha, it proves it. If it disagrees, we say, oh, it's only a mouse study, it doesn't matter. And I don't think we can dismiss all the studies that disagree with the conclusions.
I have a question. I have always heard that low-fat diets were implicated in decreasing the incidence of stroke and heart disease as well as most cancers. And if I'm not mistaken, I heard you say that low-fat diets are implicated in the increased incidence of stroke as well as some cancers. Could you explain this, please?
There have been several studies that have found this relationship of low serum cholesterol and low-fat diets, particularly in Japanese participants, with increased risk of stroke and certain types of cancer. And I think one of the problems is that in the scientific policy arena, people who are deciding that we should all be on low-fat diets have ignored these types of studies. And I think I would be much more comfortable with the dietary recommendations if we were told, yes, there may be a downside to this. I don't think we should ignore this. I don't think people are that naive that they can be presented with risks and benefits and come to their conclusions. I agree with most of the dietary recommendations of the Heart Association. I agree with a lot of Dr. Jacobson's dietary recommendations. But I don't think I agree with their certainty with which we will reduce incidence of various diseases.
Let me just add something, if I may, Doris. I think we're getting some weak-need recommendations, weaker need than they need to be. For instance, to have a doctor from the American Heart Association reassure a heart disease patient that it's okay to eat Ben & Jerry's ice cream, I think is asinine and dangerous. And for one thing, Ben & Jerry's doesn't even have nutrition labeling. It's extremely high in fat. It's exactly the kind of food that he should not eat. And if that were my father, for instance, I would certainly advise him to cut down and to go through his diet and look at where he's getting his fat, where he's getting his sodium, and cut those out as much as he can. And that would be prudent, I think. And for each of us who doesn't have heart disease, I think it's important to know what I think is the best possible diet and move in that direction. And that means eating whole grains rather than the fluffy white bread. If you want red meat, eat roast beef instead of hamburgers. Something like a Burger King double beef Whopper with cheese is a death burger. Don't eat that stuff. And you know, is that prudent? Is that prudent? Come on,
Michael, I think it is prudent. I think because people are going to do that, and what you need to give people, the public, is sound advice regarding a total diet The public is going to eat margarine. They are going to eat ice cream. They need to know that an ice cream contains X amount, and we have the ability to do it, to tell them that a certain serving size of ice cream will contain approximately this amount of fat. If you're going to do that, then you have to look at the rest of your daily diet and realize that you may have just taken up your 300 milligrams of cholesterol in that half a cup of ice cream.
Well,
That's
look,
it for the day.
my goal isn't 300 milligrams of cholesterol. There's no benefit from eating that greater amount of cholesterol. I want to cut down. I don't want to have that ice cream. I'm going to have a piece of fruit for dessert.
Do you have any data, though, that eating 200 milligrams of cholesterol for the average healthy American adult is appropriate?
It's a matter of odds. I think 200 is better than 300. I think that 100 is better than 200. There are many studies on vegetarians showing health benefits of very low cholesterol, low-fat diets. And if you want to look at the Japanese and stroke, don't blame it on the low-fat diet. Look at their extremely high sodium intake.
Those studies were done factoring out the relationship between sodium and the incidence. The studies that we're referring to, that David's referring to, that I'm referring to, looking at stroke incidence in the Japanese, factored everything out and then realized that the one factor that seemed to be significant was the cholesterol level. And so your sodium argument is incorrect. It clearly relates to fat intake, and it's fascinating data.
Well, I think we'll have to continue that particular argument another time. It seems that because I'm not familiar with those particular studies. Now, it seems, Dr. Klurfeld, that you're saying, be prudent, don't make any changes, especially in policies. What that means is that it's industry that's making the policies. We're at the mercy of McDonald's. We're at the mercy of General Foods, of Campbell. If they put in this much sodium, that's what we're going to get. Why not tell people the best? Is it better to have less sodium or more sodium, less fat or more fat, or you just throw up your hands?
But you can take that to the ultimate extreme, 0 sodium, 0 fat. And that is clearly impossible. There's natural sodium.
That's right.
Fat is essential in the diet.
We needn't worry about fat deficiencies. Is there anybody in America who has a fat deficiency?
There are young children who have been hospitalized with failure to thrive, being put on yuppie diets.
Yeah, there have been a few. There have been a few, I grant you. It's extremely difficult to get that kind of a diet.
Mike, you have to be very, very careful, though, here, though. And I think, first of all, we have the children. Clearly, these recommendations do not relate to young children under the age of 2.
That's right. I agree with that.
One has to understand that very clearly. Then let's go back to your analogy with the ice cream issue, because you're falling into the same trap that, unfortunately, the Food and Drug Administration did when we rolled out Heart Guide. They were saying that margarine shouldn't be in there because it's a bad food. There are not good and bad foods. There are good and bad diets. And what you've got to do for the American public, for the people that are listening to this conversation, is teach them how to eat good diets, so that no individual is going to eat a stick of margarine like a banana. But they need to know what a serving size is of the margarine and how much fat is in that serving size. Same thing holds for ice cream, a 3-ounce piece of steak. All of that can be done. The technology is there, and the public wants that information and deserves it. Then they'll make sound, healthy dietary choices.